Okay, well, welcome everyone to the 130th episode of History Matters, and so does coffee. Today, hold that up again, Annie. Gotta see your mug because that's a History Matters bingo mug. Today, as I said in my tweets, I want to talk about the controversy that appears to have erupted because Lizzo played James Madison's crystal flute during a concert. And I want to approach that in a couple of different ways. But before I do that, I want to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who is going to explain to us the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. As always, I'm delighted to be with you guys on Fridays. We have already a robust chat going on here if you're joining in from Zoom. So please continue to engage in the chat, throw your links in there, your comments. But we know this topic, people went crazy last night, Joanne, when you released this topic.
Oh, okay.
So you know. And so there are many, many people who are very interested in this discussion this morning. And we know you have questions. It's a great topic. We know you will have questions. We love your questions, but we will only see your questions if you put them in the Q&A. And the only other thing I think we want to help plug for our friends at National Council for History Ed is the conference, which is coming up in the spring. I think it's too late to submit a proposal, but we would love for you to join us there. A bunch of us will be there. We hope all of you that tune every week to History Matters will be there, and we will try and figure out something to do with the community, right, Joanne?
Yes.
To finally see each other after all this, the last couple of years. So we're ready to get started. We'll look for your questions in the chat, and we'll see you in a little bit. Thanks, Joanne.
And the one thing I'll add to that is anyone who is here for the first time, please tell us that you're here for the first time, because the History Matters community is actually a community, and you will get warmly welcomed if you say that you're here for the first time. So in chat, go ahead, mention it. And now off to today's topic. So I close this here. Okay. So I could not avoid this topic. I didn't want to, but I also couldn't. And I think what set me off, so for those of you who haven't seen my tweeting, I really do want to talk about this whole controversy about Lizzo playing James Madison's honorary crystal flute. What really got me going and made me think that I have to find some way to talk about this in a layered way, because there's a lot happening here, was when someone used the word desecrated. That Lizzo playing that flute at that concert desecrated the flute. Now, obviously, there's a lot of racism going on here, and I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but come on. The howling and screaming about a woman who is trained, who is a musician, who plays the flute, playing the flute on a stage with the permission of the Library of Congress, playing two notes, clearly expressing on her face the joy and excitement that she felt at doing this. I think she said something along the lines of history is cool, history is so cool, something like that, makes our hearts happy, those of us who understand the power and importance of history, and then gave it back. So desecrated is an interesting word to use. What's interesting to me about this, and obviously the racial component is off the charts to the point that it's although I'm sure people will be denying that, it's kind of hard to miss it. What I wanted to talk about was, in part, the power of objects, and particularly in this case, an object associated with a founder, and the power that has when placed, in this case, into the hands of a Black woman to set people off. It is true, and this is a thing that is near and dear to my heart, that things, artifacts from history, have a power to them. They do. And I realize that as a historian, I always feel as though I'm supposed to somehow be jaded about this, and I'm not. I always, when I go to archives and I'm doing research, I always, decades after first beginning to do this, experience the thrill of touching manuscripts from the period I'm studying, not because they're just old, but because even a simple letter, a manuscript, what that means, excuse me, and I try to teach this to my undergraduates, a letter, an 18th century letter, particularly in an age when letters were the main form of communication, it means that someone sat down in some way at a table, at a desk somewhere with something to say, put pen to paper on that piece of paper and sat there and figured out what they wanted to say. It's an action, right? A manuscript isn't a piece of paper. It actually represents an act of the past, a person in the past putting intent and meaning on paper. So you're not just touching a piece of paper, you're touching, in a sense, a moment from the past. A moment when someone felt that they needed to do or say or write something, and they did. There's a power to that. There's a connection to the humanity of the past. And by humanity, I mean humanness of the past. That has a real power, I think, no matter what you're touching. In the case of James Madison's honorary crystal flute given to him, I gather, in 1813, James Madison, so if you're dealing with something associated with a capital F founder, that has added value, symbolic value, I guess I'll put it that way, because it's a person that everyone knows and a founder of the country and etc. It's an important person in the founding of the country. And so any object, same thing with hair. I think I've talked before about the amount of hair, founder hair, that I've touched over the years. Lots of founder hair. And people saved it for a reason, right? It was like a little piece of a person who had been alive, and it was a little remnant of that living person, which is why it's a little creepy, but still. So objects have a power, even pieces of paper, but particularly objects have a power. And popular culture acknowledging historical objects has an extra bonus power, right? So Lizzo, not only acknowledging this flute, but being excited about playing it, linking it to, history, woo, like this is exciting. We're making history tonight, I believe is what she said, right? The first person, certainly since Madison's time, seemingly to play that flute. When popular culture, as we all know who live in the age of Hamilton, the musical, when popular culture grabs a hold in any way, and not just the founders, but in any way of history and succeeds, it brings history to a broad public in a way that's wonderful to see. And as an early American historian, that's been, regardless of what we say, and we can have a long discussion about what we do or don't like about Hamilton the musical and what's accurate and what isn't accurate and what the accuracy or inaccuracy means, different conversation. But the fact of the matter is, because of that musical and the way in which it brought into popular culture something that really wasn't in popular culture, the founding, making it human and someone's going to get bingo, stressing the contingency of that moment. It's not all written in stone. It gave that past to a lot of people and a lot of different kinds of people who hadn't felt that they owned it before, right? And I'm talking about anyone who, among other things, is not white. It gave that history to a sweeping, broad audience in a way that has power and in a way that, as an early American professor, gives me joy, because people now understand the meaning and the importance of that history, or if nothing else, that it's there and that it has import. And even if you want to say, oh, the play was really wrong and it didn't include many things and it basically didn't grapple with slavery very much at all, fine. As a teacher, I can say, come on in, like, now that you know it exists, have I got stuff to show you? And I could talk about the ways in which some of the stuff that was in there is absolutely accurate from letters from the time period. Some things aren't there. So let's talk about that, right? There's a bigger tent of early American history because of that. So Lizzo playing this flute, and not only that, but acknowledging her excitement of playing it, the significance of it to her. Not only that, but not doing that in isolation, but first going to the Library of Congress. I think she spent about 3 hours at the Library of Congress playing different flutes in the library's collection, and then was given permission to go on stage and play Madison's flute. So she went into a wonderful archive, and I was employed by the Library of Congress for a number of years. So I can vouch for the wonderfulness of the Library of Congress and for the amazing, amazing things that it has in its archive. She went to the archive, she acknowledged the specialness and power and meanings that can be given to objects when they're placed in the present, and people in the present interact with them, and then brought that to a broader public on stage. To me, that is a fine thing, right? That is doing something that archives don't always do, not that they don't want to, but their mission of most archives is to protect and preserve artifacts, items, manuscripts, and to essentially make them available to scholars and those who want to use them. The public-minded mission of archives, some archives have that public-minded mission, some don't. It depends on the archive. That's an extra bonus. I celebrate it when it happens. I don't blame an institution when it doesn't, because it's hard. The Library of Congress has a special status on that front because it is the library of the US Congress, but it's a government library, right? It's our, in that sense, our library. So it does have some kind of a public mission. And I think this is a fine way to remind people of that and bring it into the public eye. Now, when I worked there, the Library of Congress, as an employee, this is actually, I don't quite remember when they shut this down, but for a time, as an employee, I could wander around in the stacks looking for things, right? Because I was employed there to do exhibits. They're like essentially museum exhibits, and then to do educational products for them in the American Memory Program, helping to contextualize collections of things that were being digitized and put online. I could go and walk in the stacks to find things for whatever it is I was working on, which was, they were like hallelujah moments to me, because and it's not as though, Madison's flute is sitting out on a shelf. I'm like, woo-hoo, look at this. I was mostly wandering around and looking at books. But over the course of the years that I worked there were amazing, amazing things that are just in storage at the library. If you had a reason to see them or need them, you could see them and use them. But the riches that are at that library are beyond description. And the fact that this episode has hinted at that for the public, has kind of shown in a different way that probably many people haven't seen before, the realness of the past, right? An object, and that it literally can speak to the present. That's all for the good. And I think that's wonderful. It's a wonderful message for a library, for the Library of Congress, and for someone who is as popular and celebrated as Lizzo to be the person delivering that message. I think that is all good. But it really does remind me, or made me think in a variety of ways, of the humanness of the past. And in some way, it's that humanness, I think, that is part of the, what do I want to call it? The underflow of some of the anxiety of this moment, right? The people who are really upset and who are saying that somehow or other by Lizzo playing that flute, it has been desecrated. Well, the humanity of the past is that James Madison, a white founder, did a lot of great things and also was a slave owner. That he owned that flute, it belonged to him, and now it is being put in a very different context. Some people, I think, are, and in this moment in time, and we've talked about this before, the founders, all capital letters, right? That for some people, that's really much of what American history is an image of the founders in all capital letters doing great founderly things, writing great documents and doing wonderful things. And they did write great documents and do wonderful things. They also made some pretty severe mistakes and failed in some ways. Nothing is perfect, and certainly neither the past or the present. So, and we've talked about this before too, that the only way to grapple with American history is to really understand it and to have one's feet planted firmly in the present is to confront the past in all of its complexity, to look at the bad as well as the good, to see the failures, to see the hopes and the failures, to see lost opportunities and opportunities taken, to see all of the complexity of how we as a nation got to where we are now. The flute in an object is wrapping a lot of that up in a really interesting way that is causing a lot of emotion. And as I said, some of it really obviously has to do with race and the fact that some largely white men are upset that a Black woman played this particular flute in front of the public on stage in a sparkly outfit. Whatever the other things are that are offending people. But the reason that that's offensive to these people is it's a founder object. It's a founder object. And it has been desecrated by being used in the way that it was used. It can enable us to reckon with what we do with founding moments, how we should really embrace the complexity of the past. This example of people being upset that the magical flute that no one knew existed before this week as somehow being desecrated, it's a very limited way of understanding the past. It's a very kind of storybookish way of looking at the past, right? We had heroes and they did heroic things, and you can't desecrate them. That's not only is that not understanding the humanness of the past, that's literally inhuman, right? That there's no humanness in that way of understanding the past. And many of us here, I know, are history teachers, historians, so our business is thinking about the humanness of the past. But whether we are or whether we aren't, it's so important, particularly right now, for us to think about the spectrum of what we encompass in American history. And the founders, speaking as someone who has been teaching about the founders for several decades, for many people, that's the first test of whether they're able to step away from the story and embrace the complexity. Now, I realize, and I can't, I see things, there's a lot going on there on the bottom of the screen conversation, which I can't plug into, which is somewhat frustrating. I will say, I know we'll come to questions and we'll have a lot to say. But I now lost where I was going because I got so excited by what was there. At any rate, the larger point that I'm making here is what's happening now, the excitement and panic and upsetness and drama and emotion happening about this flute is actually a one step removed conversation about how we address our history. And there are some people who very aggressively have one part of a conversation they want to address, and everything else around it feels like a threat. And I've talked about this before too, that we always need to think about the emotion that we're seeing or feeling in response to words or images that were being shown, right? We've talked about that many times over the last 129 episodes, that if you're feeling a strong emotional response to something that you're seeing or hearing that has any kind of political content these days, the best thing to do is to stop and ask yourself, is there someone who really wants me to feel that way? Is this really a political move or not? What does the emotion mean? What does it mean that I'm having this kind of an emotional reaction? I think we ask that about ourselves, and I think we ask that about others as well. What does all the emotion mean? Why are people so upset? Why are they using dramatic words like desecrate? That really gets back to the larger story of what parts of our history are we willing to accept, and what do we do by refusing to accept parts of it? What parts of ourselves as a nation, do we pretend don't exist by ignoring them or denying them or cutting them out of the story of ourselves. It's a complicated story. It's got some really ugly parts. And James Madison's flute, right? The Enlightenment, the crystal flute, a founder, the Constitution, right? President of the United States, and Virginia slaveholder. All true. And we've talked about this before, and I've tweeted happily about this before, maybe not happily, but I've tweeted about this before, that acknowledging the bad doesn't mean you're denying the good. And there's sometimes, I think, in the ongoing, not quite ranting, but scolding conversation about some related issues to what I'm talking about now. Somehow or other, there's a yes or no, there's no gray area between. Either everything is good or everything is bad, and there's nothing in between. And there is some good. There is. The founders did some wonderful things. They also failed miserably in a lot of ways. They didn't live up to their ideals. And that matters. That's who we are. The ideals matter and the failure matters. All of that, in one way or another, is being encapsulated in a way that probably a lot of people can't specifically put their finger on right now, but it's causing a lot of emotion. And it's been days worth of emotion, right? Because a Black woman played a founder's flute on stage. That's that. The meaning of that and the ways in which it, to use a wonderful word, it would behoove us. I don't think I normally say that in conversation, to really think about what this means and why people are so upset and what it says about the present. All of that is exceedingly important. An example of the power of things. When I worked at the Library of Congress, I worked on exhibits. They were putting on exhibits. And there was a wonderful woman curator, and her business was not just curating and putting together exhibits, but she was particularly skilled. The thing that I love about doing exhibits and loved is that you're asking people to walk a certain path, and you're weaving the story that you want to tell into that path, so that as people walk, they're putting together the story that you want them to see. And in this case, the person who, her wonderful curator named Kim Rice, she helped design this exhibit. And there was a point in which you turn a corner. It was about the bicentennial of Congress, I believe. You turn a corner, and what was in front of you was a glass case, and in it was one thing: a set of shackles used on an enslaved person. That's it. And as you're wandering through thinking about the history of Congress, and you turn a corner and that's in front of you, it hits you like a slap in the face. And that was precisely what it was meant to do. That had power. That had real power. This one object just sitting there didn't require, obviously, an explanation, just the placement of it. That captures some of what I'm talking about here, about the power of objects, the power of the past, the humanness, the connection with the humanness, and the ways in which that can launch people off into forcing them in some ways to reckon with or deliberately ignore the human reality of the past in all of its complexity, in all of its many dimensions. That's some of what we're seeing right now. Desecrate really got me angry because of the racial component of this conversation makes me really angry. And desecrate somehow captured that for me. Like, really? Desecrate an object that you didn't know existed 2 days ago and that hasn't been played, and that archives very often, Library of Congress, as they've said since the breakout of this fuss, they have many objects that, particularly instruments, that not only are meant to be played, but sometimes they're given to the library with explicit instructions that they should be able to be played by researchers and people who want to use them. So, at any rate, there's a lot going on right now in relation to this, about the past, about American history, about the stories that we do or don't tell about ourselves, about race at this moment, about how we understand our past at this moment, about what we're excluding from our past at this moment. There's a lot wrapped up in this moment, and it makes me angry, but it's also, I think, an important moment to step back and think about all that's being revealed right now. Just this morning when I went online, and I was digging around online just to kind of see the language that was being used in relation to this incident in preparation for this conversation. Wow. It's the fact that it's launched this kind of uproar. It's partly political. It's partly, what you do if you are in a polarized conversation and you're an extreme in one direction and you find something to glom onto, and it's, ooh, yay, culture war. There are any number of reasons why people are making a big deal out of this on one side more than the other, which is true. If some people on the right weren't fussing about it, I think this moment would have happily passed, and some history teachers would have been happy that she said history is cool, and that would have been the end of it. But I think, and I hope we talk about this. Richard used the phrase that I love, rage farming, which became popular, as far as I know, in January, I think of this year. I have it. I'm writing something and that's in it. And I tracked when it first really came into wide usage. And I think it's January of this year, but at any rate, it's recent. It's during our polarized present. I think it, as I said, behooves us, and I hope that we, in our conversation, I'll stop in a moment or two so that we can have that conversation, can really get at the meaning of the fuss. What does it say about us? Because that's what it's speaking to, about what we want to be, about who we think we are, about what we are denying in thinking about who we are, about why there's so much emotion wrapped up in it, about what people want that emotion to do. There's so much here in this moment. And the amount of fuss, given the fact that it's a Black woman playing a founder's flute, that tells you a lot about meanings and significance that people are investing this moment in, that actually go way beyond the moment and really are about the stories that we do or don't tell about ourselves, and the things in our past that we do or don't want people to acknowledge or see, or the people in the present who we don't want to have, who some people don't want to have speaking about those things, right? This is about storytelling and silences. It's about the power of presence and a desire to suppress things. That's the moment that we're in. I'll just add one last thing, which I can talk about. I see people are already saying mug, mug, mug. If there are new folks here, every week I do have a mug that in one way or another relates to, I'm wiping the lipstick off, relates to the topic that we're discussing. I'll say it. I went to a meeting in West Point. I thought of that this morning, because being there in person also, in a sense, gave me a sense of history that no matter how much one reads about something, when you place yourself in that spot, it has a realness and, again, a humanness. You suddenly understand the landscape, literally mental landscape of people who were in that place at that time. It reminded me of this because it's yet another way in which, at least for me this week, the reality of the past made itself known and hit me again, even though I've been doing this for many decades. Still, the power of this kind of thing, of the reality of the past in one way or another, you can't exaggerate it, and we're seeing that right now. Okay, so the mug. So I wasn't sure initially what mug I was going to use, and then I saw this in the back of the cupboard. I'm sure I've used it. I actually think someone here gave it to me, and my apologies for forgetting. I know there's a list somewhere, a master mug list of all of the mugs people have sent me, and I'm glad, because I don't have a memory for that. At any rate, this is what my mug says. Today we are making history. It's a Lizzo quote, basically, without even knowing it was a Lizzo quote. It has on it, it's spilled ink because writing the history is in process, right? So I kind of love this mug for this particular moment. We are in process. And in a sense, that's what this conversation has been about.
I love that mug. I don't think you've used that one before. I
I
don't
might
remember it.
have. If there's someone out there, right? Carolee doesn't remember either. I really think someone gave it to me.
But have we used it?
I don't know. I don't
I
know.
love the back of it because
History
we always tell kids that history is messy,
history,
right? And that, like,
here, Bess.
gosh,
Bess sent it with the tricorn hat, which is now being worn by the pigeon behind me.
Beth, did you get that when we were at Monticello, or did you send it a long time ago? I wonder. I've never seen that mug. I love it.
Okay, well, maybe I haven't used it. And thank you, Beth, for sending that along.
It is
a wonderful mug, and you have now been applauded for it, Beth.
Beth, if you remember where you got that mug, please put it in the chat, because I bet a lot of us would love to have that. Somebody was laughing when you said you're about to do the mug reveal in the chat, and they said, was it going to be a crystal mug? So I ran before I turned my camera back on and got my little crystal mug that I got at some teacher conference a couple of years ago.
That would have been, I don't have a crystal mug, but if I had, that would have been pretty perfect.
Well, I'm going to drink my tea out of this, and I will think of all of you tonight, and I'm going to pretend like I'm Lizzo drinking tea. All right, we have questions. My favorite part. Are we ready? All right, the first question comes from our friend Miranda. She says she was intrigued to see Lizzo play the flute, but does the twerking with it as she played it make a difference? She watched the clip and was concerned about her dropping it while she was twerking. She had no problem with it up until that point, and then it was like, you know, oh my gosh, she's twerking and she's holding this valuable object, and you know. So did you have any comment on that?
You know, when I was thinking this morning about what I was going to say, and I thought, okay, what is the desecration, right? Is it a Black woman playing the flute? Is it the flute being played on the stage? The only thing I could land on is maybe someone's upset that while she's playing the flute, she's twerking. To me, moving your hips around while you're playing the flute isn't desecration. I think it's totally, oh, she twerked at the Library of Congress too? I do not know. I personally don't think that equals desecration. She's a trained musician who plays the flute and is a performer, and she did both. You know, I think I hadn't thought about it. I suppose one might have been worried that she would drop it, but I mean, part of what was wonderful about the little clip that I saw, she was so excited about it, right? The excitement and the joy of her playing that flute, knowing what it was, having the chance to do that, playing a handful of notes and then handing it back. That was wonderful to see, right? That was what you should feel when you're engaging with history, right? The excitement of the humanness of it in some way or another. And it was wonderful to see her with that. So I don't know, the twerking, I didn't really focus on. Even if you focus on it, I don't think shaking your hips a few times equals desecration. But that's me.
Yeah. I had put something in there earlier that to me, a lot of it was a generational thing. Like, it makes me think of when Elvis would wiggle his hips and all the older people went crazy and all the kids loved him. All I know is when she put that tweet out saying history was freaking cool, a lot of kids were retweeting it, reposting it, making their own TikToks about it. Like, it, for a moment, history was cool again, right?
Yes. Well, that's what I'm saying, is that if someone in popular culture, who's wildly popular in popular culture, in a sincere way, has an experience and says that. So it wasn't like she, you know, a paid commercial advertisement.
Right.
She was just experiencing the excitement of engaging with something from history. How wonderful is that, right? That's the best of teachers give that off when they're teaching about history, their engagement with it and their excitement with it, or their horror at it, but their emotional engagement with history. You know, it matters. It's who we are. It's not the only thing you should be communicating, but we all know, you know, if I can communicate to my students my excitement at engaging with and figuring out the things I'm figuring out, they're going to want to do the same thing.
Yeah. And JJ is an actual flautist, is that the right word? And was saying that like marching bands, kids that play the flute, the marching band, they do pretty much dance routines nowadays out there. So
I guess that's true. She was in a marching band with her flute.
mm-hmm.
That's true.
Yeah. Okay. So our next question comes from our friend Sandra Peters. She says, fascinating topic. Do you think that bringing life to the past into the present produces anxiety that the past isn't frozen, that the Constitution's living and can't be interpreted from an originalist point of view? And is that the ideology dominating the right wing that got so upset about a Black woman playing a flute?
Interesting. Well, I mean, frozen is an interesting word. I definitely think, I wouldn't even say that the past is frozen in place. I would say some people want the past to be frozen in the way that they want it to be frozen, right? And so that some of what we're seeing is this doesn't line up with that. And the founders are always a central part of that. How do we treat them? How do we view them? How do we study them? What do we acknowledge about them? I don't know if I've talked about this or if I'm just writing about it now. I've already forgotten with 130 episodes what I've said here versus what I'm writing about. But, some of what we're seeing is, and I want to put this carefully, if you have always been in power and you assume that you should always be in power, anything that suggests to you that you might not still have that unquestioned power feels like a threat. So there are some people who have been in power for a long time and feel that they should always be in power, and anyone or thing that comes along and suggests maybe they're going to have a little bit less power feels to them like the world is being overturned, when in fact what's happening is they have a little bit less power. They're not being, what was the word? There was another word beside desecrated. There was some crazy word about it's everything's being overturned. It's chaos. It's like, well, it might feel that way if you truly believe that you should always be totally on top, not unquestioned 100% of the time. If that's what you believe, democracy is a problem. If you sincerely believe that you should always be on top unquestionably, as it's always been in your mind, and that nothing of that should change, democracy, by definition, can challenge that. Democracy is based on contests, and people win them and people lose them, and then there's another contest that comes along. So to me, in part, some of what we're seeing at this moment is people who, whether they have been aware of it or not, have long assumed that they belong on top. And anything that questions that things are not going to be exactly the same feels to them like a huge global assault, right? All that's happening is some other people are getting a voice, so they're going to have other voices in the mix with them. Democracy is a threat. If you feel entitled to power and never want to give it up, democracy is a problem. So some of the things that we're seeing now, some of the big emotion of this moment has to do with that simple fact. And I think people having the big emotion aren't stepping back and thinking about the meaning of that. It's just, I know how things should be, and now they're not that way, and it's bad. The larger meaning is worth thinking about. And why democracy is thus a problem at this particular moment for some people, worth thinking about.
Yeah, I had put in the chat earlier while you were talking about Aretha Franklin. I don't know if it's the Super Bowl or at some event she sang the Star Spangled Banner. I was little, so it must have been like in the 70s. And I remember my grandmother didn't like it because she said she jazzed it up. She wasn't comfortable with her not singing it very traditionally. But I remember as kids, we were all like, the five of us were like all glued to the TV because it was Aretha Franklin and we loved her, but grandma wasn't having it. And we had this whole discussion about it. And that has just always stuck in my mind. And that's what I thought of when the Lizzo story broke. But
in that case, you had a discussion about it.
We did. Yeah. Right? There was no rage farming at grandma's house.
No, exactly. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
right? I mean, that can be a good thing. I see JJ says playing the instrument. I can't see the whole thing, but is honoring
playing
it.
an instrument is honoring it, not desecrating it. Yep.
Yes.
A real musician knows that. A real musician knows that. And JJ is a real musician.
Precisely. So that is true. But being able to have a conversation with someone who says, in a better world than we're in at the moment, someone who said this is desecrating things, you could say, really, how would you say that? Like, what's desecrating it? And you could actually have a conversation. Whenever it is that I first really started using Twitter, I could still engage with people and say, why do you think that? And we would have engaged in a conversation, and I felt that I was heard, and I think the person felt that often he was heard. And I would feel that I communicated something. I got some people to question something. That's harder to make happen nowadays. So
yeah, I think that's why people like me and Carolee and the other teachers in the group, we have these Monday night Twitter chats. I don't know if you're familiar with them. It's sort of like, it's similar to this, but it's on Twitter. But for the last 13 years, every single Monday night, history teachers from around the country get on at the exact same time, and somebody throws a topic out and there's a moderator. And it's been like one of the most joyous communities. And so Carolee and I are like, we have this bookend, and we start Monday with SS Chat and we end Friday with History Matters. Anything could happen in the middle, but at least we have those two bookends per week.
That's actually very cool.
It is very cool. Okay, we got more questions. This is one from our friend Gloria. I don't know if this is a question for you or maybe Tim, because he's always got all the links handy, but she's asking if we know why Madison was given a flute.
I mean, I can tell you in my brief poking around online, I would not put this in writing because I would want to confirm it. But let me think about the timing here. What I read was that it had something to do with his inauguration, but if that's the case, it would be his second term, right? So that the only reference I saw, because I was trying to figure that out, was that it was made in honor of his inauguration. But if it was 1813, that would be his second term. So perhaps that is it. Apparently, the flute maker, whose name I've now forgotten, but it begins with an L, Tim, yes, 1813, made a number of these crystal flutes, and there's, I don't know, 100 and something of them in existence, and the Library of Congress has, Laurent, there it is, has a number of them, has, I want to say, like 65 or something, a lot of them. This one just happens to be, oh, there we go, only 185 survived, thank you. This just happens to be a founder flute. So yeah.
So it's a rare flute, but it's even more important because a founder owned it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So Cece is asking, are there examples from early America where there was manufactured outrage, like the flute incident, based on something that was either incorrect or not important, but obviously did or did not affect an election or another important kind of an outcome? Can you think of any place else where an object kind of...
Oh, an object. Yeah. Let me think about that.
Manufactured outrage over that.
Well, this isn't quite the same, but the first thing that pops into my mind is the election of 1800, which is a really, really fraught election, and the Federalists, who have been in power for almost a decade and feel that they deserve to be on top and deserve to have power always, are now feeling threatened by the Jeffersonian Republicans, who are more small d Democratic, and are definitely going to change the pacing of things and the logic of things. They begin howling that the Jeffersonian Republicans are coming for your Bible. Hide your Bibles. They're coming for your Bible, right? And there were some people who hid their Bibles, right? So it's not quite the same, but it is, in the sense that, the Bible became this symbolic thing that represented the Federalists, or the proper godly people who understand and honor the Bible, and the crazy Jeffersonian Republicans, the sort of anarchists and atheists, and who are corrupted by the French Revolution, and they're coming for your Bible. That was at least an object that was politicized in the approach of an election.
Now they're coming for your guns. That's what I always hear is they're coming for your guns if you
Right.
elect the,
Right. I know that.
AOC
Right.
or whatever her
And it
squad.
doesn't matter how many times you're like, keep your guns.
Yeah.
Keep your.
Just don't bring them to school.
Don't bring him to school.
Yeah. All right. This one comes from Dave. He says, there are only so many hours in the day and our attention span is limited. Given the January 6th committee, Ginny Thomas, the upcoming elections, election deniers, etc., is not the flute desecration just another distraction, an emotional trigger to keep people eyes on the prize? But democracy is in peril. Like, let's distract him with this flute thing because Ginny Thomas is testifying today.
Totally.
Dave.
Totally,
Wow.
right. Totally possible. I think that all the time. Shiny object, right? That if there's something going on, there's going to be an attempt to grab at some other thing. And, right now it's largely people on the right screaming about it. There's a handful of things I saw representing another viewpoint. I even paused this morning. I was like, should I even be talking about this at all? Because I do actually think it's an attempt to grab attention and make a point. But yeah, I think to some degree that's true, but I think it's also worth noting what thing they've seized on to do that with and what message they're sending with it, because they are, on the one hand, and what's interesting is, I can't remember who, someone on the right said, basically those people on the left, like doing things to get people outraged. So like, I don't actually think that's why this woman stood up on stage and played the flute. But screaming about it, that's something to try and get people outraged. So I do think I don't like the phrase culture war, because on the one hand it objectifies it in some weird way and makes it seem not real or not as potentially bloody and human as it can be. But I do think some of this is strategic. Some of it is sincere, but the sincerity of it is bound up with some things that are worth thinking about. Why it seems so outrageous to some people.
This is a good one from Dave.
Uh-oh.
It says, to be desecrated, it requires consecration. Is not a deeper concern that we idolize the founders rather than humanize them?
Ooh, that's a good one. And
good one.
I go along with that 100%.
That's a mug.
That is.
Write that down, Carolee. That's a mug.
You can acknowledge people in the past. You can respect people in the past for what they did, even as you acknowledge what they didn't do or what they failed to do or what crimes or sins they committed. You can do all of those things without consecrating the past. And if by consecrate you mean sort of a religious sensibility to it, sort of putting it, as we said before, kind of in stone, like it's this glorious sort of religious thing in the past that has been consecrated and blessed and cannot be touched. Yeah, we should really not be doing that with the founders. And I've talked about this before. The founders themselves said so, right? John Adams, wonderful series of statements by him in his old age, when he got letter after letter after letter from people that basically said, tell us about the founding, right? Tell us about writing the Declaration. Tell us. And Adams said over and over and over again, we weren't so special. We didn't know what we were doing. We made mistakes all the time. Some people signed that declaration and they really, really didn't want to. And I could see it on their face. Just stop, right? The point isn't that we were superhuman and special. The point is we did what we did and kind of hoped others would take over after us and keep going. It's not about consecrating the founders. That's not what they expected or wanted. And in some way, it felt irresponsible and small d democratic.
It's interesting because Lizzo hosted Saturday Night Live last year, and they just a couple weeks ago replayed that. And there was a very similar skit to what just happened this week, where she was invited to play with this fancy symphonic orchestra. And she played her flute, like her own flute, I guess. Or I don't know if they brought her a flute, but she was twerking, and the people in the fancy, very stuffy orchestra were upset about it. So it's almost like art imitating life, or in this case, it was life imitating art.
Wow.
I mean, it was literally a Saturday Night Live skit last season that they just replayed about 2 weeks ago.
That's really funny. I didn't see that. I
Yeah.
do know that in real life, she virtually played, I think, with the New York Philharmonic.
She's classically trained. Yeah. That's the thing. Like, a lot of kids that watch pop artists don't realize many of them do have a very formal training. Some of them don't. Like, I know some of them, you know, the drummers I follow never learn to read music. It's all by ear. But there are others that have like extensive.
She's been playing the flute for a very long time.
She's well, Tim made a big deal. She's from Minnesota. He wanted everybody to know she got her training in Minnesota. Yeah, that was important to him. Good, Tim.
Now what I'm seeing flashing across the bottom of my screen here in the question area or in the chat area, sadness. What are people being sad about?
Oh.
If not, I don't mean to stop our
no, I'm not sure. Somebody will put it back in the chat. Tell us why people are sad. Okay. And also Tim says she played at University of Houston. So
okay,
Stacy can claim her. Okay, Gloria asked, is it possible her movements offended some people because she was a wonderful flautist?
I mean, you know, as I said, you know, or as I partially said before, maybe, you know, as far as what desecrated whatever happened there, that's the only possible thing I could see people objecting to. If they're objecting to the fact that a Black woman who's wildly popular played the flute on stage in front of a big audience, there's nothing desecrating the flute about that. So I don't know. You know,
I suggested earlier in the chat that because sometimes she uses some colorful language in her public appearances, that they thought, you know, it was kind of like, do you kiss your grandma with that mouth kind of a mentality, you know, so because she said a naughty word or two in public. And which
I understand the logic of that, except that do we actually really evaluate the language and gestures of every human being who touches a historic object that has meaning?
Right. And I think the founders probably said some naughty words too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you did a whole backstory episode on the history of cursing, which is still one of my favorites that I can never show kids, but
that's right. No, they yeah. So, but you know, if you're saying she uses some words that are inappropriate for someone playing the flute, so how is that standard applied to any other human being ever? So anyway, I also there's more questions, so I want to let the questions go. I brought over here only to talk about the humanness, and we can talk about it more in the after party. But you know, I was thinking, what do I have here that can get across the fact that simple objects from the past have a real power? We're seeing different layers of that power now, but any object from the past makes the past real. And I've shown this, I've held this up before, but this is an original copy of the Reynolds pamphlet. And you know, I've read what's in the Reynolds pamphlet many times, right? It's not like the content of this is new to me in any way, but this was printed in 1797 and sold to someone, and it was pretty juicy at the time, right? Oh, it's a pamphlet about Alexander Hamilton confessing to committing adultery, and it belonged to. There are at least two owners whose names are inscribed on the title page. Yeah, it is pretty juicy now too. There's a power outside of the fancy cover. I don't want to show you. There's a power in just this object existing. You know, that it had a real power then, and someone held this and read it and was caught up in the moment of it. And there's a reality to that, you know, we need to consider when we're thinking about history, and for better and worse, the human reality of the past, the emotion of the past, the joy and horror of the past, part of the past, part of who we are. You can't deny the bad stuff and expect to have any understanding of who we are as a nation.
Yeah. Dave had said that Lizzo's Rumors album included a video which had a lot of Greek and Roman imagery. And he wondered if maybe that was why the Library of Congress reached out to her, was a way to kind of like connect history, because she'd used historical references in her videos. I don't know.
I have no idea.
I don't know anybody that works there. I would love to ask them that.
Yeah, I love the idea of the Library of Congress showing to the public the kinds of treasures it has and their meaning that they have, and the fact that, you know, they're the nation's library in that sense, a repository of these things, and people don't think about it. And it's an amazing place.
Oh, yes. Before you came in, I was saying, when I was a kid, that was like one of my favorite buildings. I could just spend all day there. You know, when you grew up in DC, you take for granted that you can go to those places anytime you want. And yeah, their map collection just, it's like,
yeah, it's one of my happy places.
Yeah, mine too, for sure. Okay, we only have 2 questions left. Do you think we can squeeze them in?
Yes.
Beth, our buddy Beth asks, which founders would have enjoyed Lizzo playing a valuable instrument? Do we know like which founders you think would have really been tickled that she did that?
Interesting. Well, someone who appreciated music would not have liked a woman or a Black woman playing this. You know, Jefferson was interested in music.
Yeah.
This
violin, right?
He played the violin. I don't think this particular performance would have gone over well with him. I'm trying to think of who else. Maybe Franklin. Just because he was particularly interested in musical instruments, not because he was particularly accepting, but from a sort of crudely scientific point of view, he might have, I don't know. It's a really good question, and I do not have an answer to it. Oddly enough, the person at the time who seemed to be open to new cultural phenomenon is Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr read Mary Wollstonecraft and then couldn't find a man to talk about it with him. It gave his daughter, Theodosia, a male education, meaning not just French and dancing and writing. So maybe, you know, maybe he would have been broad-minded enough to get there, oddly enough. But that's the only person right now that I can think of. I'm sure there are others I'm not thinking of.
All right, last question. Are there other examples of founding fathers' obscure tchotchkes being taken from their safe havens and brought to the forefront in a similar manner?
Founder tchotchkes.
Yeah. I don't know if I call it crystal flute a tchotchke, but
no, but I kind of love that phrase. Founder tchotchkes.
I do too.
Other examples of them being taken away from,
brought into the public light. Yeah.
Oh, I see someone said Jefferson's Quran, but that's been acknowledged that it exists, but hasn't really been taken out into the public light.
Dale put Washington's teeth. That's great.
Yeah, that's a good kind of creepy example, but yeah. Yeah, it's a hard one to think about. Again, nothing is popping into my brain, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I'm not well, there's Gouverneur Morris's leg. I know I've mentioned that before. Gouverneur Morris, who was quite a character, Gouverneur Morris, and had a wooden leg, and it's at the New York Historical Society. And yeah, exactly.
Kids are always fascinated by those sorts of objects, like anything gross.
Yes, the Goov. Someone just said the Goov. That's how I refer to it. It's the Goov, because he kind of has his wacky sense of humor, even though he is also kind of a real Federalist there. But that certainly gets carted out and exhibited a lot. I'm guessing most people don't really know, if they're wandering around the New York Historical Society, who Gouverneur Morris was. if you do, it's really weird to see, just like the hair. It's really weird. It's just really weird to touch pieces of people who lived in the past. I don't need to do that. I don't. But I'm sure there are other things I'm not thinking about that have come out of my mind. But at any rate, okay. I see we're a little past time. So oh, so Tim just quoted something from Mary Poppins, and I only saw 4 words, and I could tell that's what it was because I've seen Mary Poppins 100,000,000 times. Okay, so now to wrap this up, I first off want to thank you all for coming here and engaging in this conversation about a topic that I think we even should be talking about more, because it feels to me quite revealing, the emotion bound up with it for some. But I'm glad we at least began that conversation here. We will be back with the 131st episode next Friday, talking about who the heck knows what, because Lizzo and James Madison's Flute was not on my mind several days ago.
Not on my bingo card last week.
No, not at all. At any rate, though, I do want to thank you, as I always do, for coming here, the wonderful community that you are, for the kind of conversation that builds and sustains democracy, for engaging in democracy on a Friday morning. We are now going to segue into the after party. What that means is, if you beamed in online, went through NCHE's website, just stay right where you are, and poof, you will be in the after party. And all that means is that we will not be recording, so we can be a little freer and easier in our conversation. So please, I hope you will stay with us. If you beamed in through Facebook, you actually need to leave Facebook and join through the NCHE website to join the after party. You need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations, and that will lead you into the after party. So as we head off to party, I will just say thank you for coming. I hope you all have a really wonderful week. Thank you, Annie and John, as ever, for being here on Friday mornings and making this possible. And Annie, I've had many people tell me how wonderful you are here as my partner in crime. So
well, I love it. You know, to me, like I said, we start Monday with history people, and I end on Friday with history people. So great bookends for a great week.
Exactly. So at any rate, on to the after party we go, and I will see you folks next Friday.
Yeah. Facebook people, join us.
Yes, Facebook people, leave and then come back. ncheteach.org/conversations.
Yep. And if you're new, like Joanne said, we are a community. And if you want to keep in touch during the week, or if you want to continue the conversation a little bit more this afternoon, we have a Slack channel. And our friend Reese, who now makes the bingo cards, also helps us onboard new people into the Slack channel. So if you just put Slack in all caps, and then your name and your email address that you prefer, not a work one, because sometimes those bounce back. A Gmail is usually better, like a personal one. But she will put you in and send you an invite. And if you're a teacher, we have a separate thread once you're in called the Teacher's Lounge that we put nerdy teacher stuff in.
Excellent.